Welcome to Talking Pictures. My name is Christian Genzel. I'm a filmmaker and film journalist from Salzburg, Austria. Talking Pictures is a podcast series in which I talk to the people who made some of my favorite movies. Today's guest is Aaron Lipstadt, best known from the mid-80s onwards as a director on popular TV shows like Miami Vice, Quantum Leap, Law & Order, Crossing Jordan, The 4400, BOSCH, or Elementary. As a producer-director, he also worked on shows like The MARSHAL, The Division, Medium, and GRIMM. In our interview, however, we go back to the beginning of Aaron's career, to an independent little science fiction gem called Android, which came out in 1982 and was compared by film critic Roger Ebert to cult debut films like George Lucas's THX 1138 and John Carpenter's Dark Star. Android was produced by Roger Corman and starred Klaus Kinski as a mad scientist working on a lifelike robot called Max. The android was played by Don Opper, who also co-wrote the screenplay and then, a few years later, became a cult figure as bounty hunter Charlie in the Critic series. In our conversation, Aaron recalls how he learned the ropes at Roger Corman's company and how Android came together. He discusses working with Kinski, talks about the ideas and themes of the movie, and much more. Aaron also discusses his follow-up film City Limits, a post-apocalyptic action picture that, as he says, almost killed his career. And he recalls how he became involved with television directing, starting with an episode of Miami Vice. The interview was conducted in connection with our German-language podcast Lichtspielplatz. So if you speak German, please visit lichtspielplatz.at and check out episode number 63, which features an in-depth discussion of Android. Also, make sure to listen to my interview with Barry Opper, the producer of Android and Critters, here on Talking Pictures. If you enjoy my conversation with Aaron Lipstadt, please visit talkingpicturespodcast.com to check out more interviews and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So without any further ado, here is Aaron Lipstadt. So Aaron, before we get into Android, into the film, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background. I read on your webpage that you studied political science and international relations, and then you went on to work for Roger Corman's company. And that, I think, must have been a very unusual development. How do you go from political science to Roger Corman?
Well, I'm sure it sounds weirder than it actually was, but the university I went to had a very prominent and active film society, and I got involved. I was interested in movies, so I got involved with them pretty soon, and just watched a lot of movies, talked about a lot of movies. That was sort of my extracurricular activity more than anything else. And so when I graduated, I had kind of been preparing to go to law school. And at the last moment, I decided that was not for me. I had worked in the law school library when I was in college. That was my student job. And being around that environment did not make me want to continue in it. So at the last minute, I pivoted and I applied to Northwestern University, which had a program in film theory and criticism. Mm-hmm. So I applied to the doctoral program there and got accepted and got a master's and spent another 2 years doing research for a doctorate, which I decided, again, this is not what I want to be doing. I had for my research, I was trying to combine some aspects of my political science and economics background with my interest in movies. And I had been studying in England, and I decided I really wanted to do something that was very American. I didn't want to do a very theoretical subject that was, more or less abstract. I wanted to do something very specific. So I got interested in low budget movies, mm-hmm. and the economics of how they were distributed and how they were made and how that might affect their political content. And that, without too much difficulty, led me to Roger Corman and New World Pictures. So I met people there, and one of them, Roger's assistant, said, "Oh, you should get a job here. You know so much about this company." So that was that route.
So you never finished your thesis?
I never finished, no.
That's too bad. It would have been interesting to read.
Well, it was published. I mean, as much as I got done was published. The British Film Institute did a series on Corman, mm-hmm. on New World, and a friend of mine at the education department at the BFI knew about what I was doing, and he and I collaborated on the season at the BFI at the National Film Theater, and a monograph on Corman. So some of it exists in
Okay.
print.
So during your time at Corman's company, you were involved with quite a few cult movies, and what's interesting, I mean, Corman is very much known for launching the careers of so many young filmmakers. I mean, Peter Bogdanovich, Martin Scorsese, and Francis Ford Coppola, Robert Towne, all of these people started out at his company. So when you were there, was there a feeling of this could be this huge stepping stone?
Yeah, a lot of people were definitely aware that, of the history at that time, even more recently, Joe Dante, Jonathan Demme, Alan Arkush had gone through the company. So people were very aware that it was a way to move up. And there's a lot of sort of battlefield humor, about getting promoted and producing, Roger prided himself on hiring people who were sort of quick-witted and had a good background in film or good education and could kind of roll with the punches and respond quickly. So people did move up quickly when there was an opportunity. I mean, of course, you don't hear about the hundreds of people who worked there and never had a career or didn't have an illustrious career, but yeah, people were aware that Roger was making it sometimes 4, 5, 6 movies a year, so there's a lot of opportunities. The movies are made in 4 or 5 weeks. A lot of times, if you did a good job, you'd move on. You wouldn't stay there and do 10 pictures for Roger. It wasn't that kind of place. You'd do your picture and then you'd hope to get a better offer, partly because you made extraordinarily little money. So you did it as an education, but you couldn't have a career there because you didn't make enough to put gas in your car.
But interestingly, the time that you were there, I think, is sort of like the last period of Corman's production company, where you really have a lot of people there who are sort of graduated to much bigger things. I think it gets, I mean, he's done so many films after that, but you hear there are less and less people who actually go on to do better things or bigger things.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I don't keep up actively with a lot of people that were there when I was there, but I'm aware of a lot of them. There are a lot of people who stayed in the film business and became directors or writers or editors or producers, but none of them, since I'd say Jim Cameron, achieved that kind of international reputation that Roger was kind of known for. Jim was kind of, I'm trying to remember if there's anybody after Jim who really had a career that was kind of, and I don't know why that is. It's partly not long after that Roger sold the company and he started a new company, but I don't think it was the same. When he had that studio in Venice, those whatever it was, 5 years or so, it was just a blast. I'm very, very happy that I could experience that. It was really fun.
So what did you take away from that, what they call the Corman School of Filmmaking?
Oh, I mean, I had come there literally from writing a doctoral thesis, so about as academic as you can get. I didn't go to a filmmaking school. Northwestern was a theory program. We did have one 16 millimeter filmmaking course, but it was very rudimentary, and it was not designed to. It was not a craft program. It was not designed to give you a career in filmmaking. It was designed to give you an academic career. So when I got there, and I started out basically as a PA. I didn't know what the equipment was. I didn't know the set etiquette. I didn't know really what editing was. I mean, I knew theoretically, and I had made my short, but to be able to be on set every day, watch the dynamic of how things are done, watch the relationship between a director and actors, director and crew, how a film comes together, it was invaluable. And so by the time I got a chance to direct, it wasn't so much that I knew how to be an expert filmmaker, but what I really knew is what not to avoid, the pitfalls to stay away from. And believe me, I look back on myself then, and I'm very happy that I learned more since then and had a chance. I mean, the main takeaway is I had to have a career as a director for my, entire adult life. I never had a desk job really. I mean, I was at a desk working for Roger when I first got there. I was his assistant, but since then, I've got to have a career where I never had to go to an office and never had to, worry about, oh, it's 5 o'clock, time to go home. I've been freelance for most of my career and been able to keep working. And that's what I got from that, which is, it's an incredible gift to be able to do something that you really love and fall into that. A lot of it's luck, of course. You're at the right place at the right time. I meet someone who works at Roger. She says, you should get a job here. She says, Roger, I met this guy, he's smart. I mean, Roger knew me. I'd interviewed him for my thesis, but she made it so that I got the next job that opened up, and that led to, one thing led to another.
I see. Yeah, and quite a few of the films that you worked on during your time there have become sort of cult classics in their own right, I think, with Galaxy of Terror or the Slumber Party Massacre, where you even appear as an actor, right?
Well, that I only appeared in that movie because we didn't have money to hire a stuntman. That's literally the truth. We had this one stunt where a guy thrown down the stairs, and I said, "Oh, how are we going to pay for that? I'll do it." That's the way that happened. But it's funny because I've seen most of those movies recently. They've all come out on DVD, and I know their reputation, and I can't believe it, because I think they're just as flawed now as they were then. They show the creative restraints of not having any money and not having any time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly B movies, but they're fun, and I think what's interesting is the creativity. I think what's interesting is looking at the films and knowing just the restraints that you mentioned, that how they could do this with so little money, with just nothing which was available to them.
Well, what's amazing to me is that I look back and I think it was like a playground for the 50 or 100 of us who were down there at the time. We got to do this and have such a good time and get paid for it. And to think that anybody else will watch these movies and think they're fun to watch is just gravy. It's just a bonus. For me, it was just the experience. It was like going to movie camp.
Now, Android grew out of that Roger Corman experience, and a lot of the people that you worked with on the film were, I think, also from the movies that you worked on with Corman, from Galaxy of Terror and stuff. But it's still a very different film than the other Corman films at the time. So how did the film get started? How did that come together?
Well, generally the way Roger would make movies at that time was, he'd have, first of all, in the late 70s, early 80s, the way Roger distributed movies, and this changed very quickly in that period of the 80s. And that's one of the reasons why he sold his company, got out when he did. But he would make movies, he would distribute movies regionally. One of the reasons Roger could make money, because he was also the distributor. So he wasn't taking a percentage. He controlled distribution. And he would make some, 200 prints of a movie, and he would distribute it. The 200 prints would start in the Southeast US, and then they move to the South, and then move to the West, and then move to the Midwest, and then move to New England, So he didn't have a big investment in prints, and he would move them around. And he wanted to do something that could play quickly, that had a very clear concept, that, didn't need reviews. So he would literally have a list of 5 titles, and he'd send PAs, which basically means, 22-year-old kids just out of college, to Westwood, which is an entertainment center, or Hollywood, where people go to the movies, and they'd literally go to people in line to go to the movies, say, which of these movies would you want to see? And you'd say, Star Quest, Galaxy of Terror, Planet of Horrors, Viking Women on the Moon, whatever, and he would see what movies, what people said, oh, that sounds good. And so he would start with a title that he thought would sell. And then either he or some writer would come up with an idea that matched that title, and he'd have somebody write it. and that's how these movies got made. It was driven by what he thought would, have a scary image that you could put on the title, that you could put on a poster, that you could put in a trailer, and people that would draw people in. It was very, I wouldn't call it scientific, but it was Roger's instinct on, what kind of, horror, terror, sex, those kind of, scary monsters. And of course, he was also Alien had been a success, so he was working off that. Star Wars had been a success, so he was working off that. Whatever he could do to try and, capitalize quickly on what he thought was the prevailing kind of cultural avenue of interest. And at that time, science fiction was very popular. He bought the studio so that he could make these science fiction movies, which could all be made, on sets. He would reuse this, kind of try and reuse pieces of sets for other movies. Wasn't dependent on locations. Android was very different. It started out as an idea by two carpenters at the studio who wanted to make movies and had this idea of a kind of, they started with basically a creation myth story and said, okay, how can we make this in a way that Roger will, make it? What can we do to jazz it up? But they didn't start with that idea of, oh, we're going to sell a horror movie. They started with the idea of, we want to make this kind of interesting idea about creation and obviously man and machine. What do we call humanity? What do we call intelligence? And I think it's pretty obvious to say that if they had gone to Roger and said, we want to make this movie, he would have said, what do I need to buy your script for? But they had actually a much better idea. They went to, they knew some guys with money in Chicago, relatives of one of the producers, and said, look, we have the script. We're going to make this movie for $500,000. Do you want to put up half? Roger's putting up the other half. And then went to Roger. One of the producers, Rupert Harvey, was an accountant for Roger. So they had an in. Went to Roger and said, we got these guys in Chicago with $250,000. They want to make a movie. Do you want to go in with them? We'll make a movie for $500,000. We've got the script. Meanwhile, I had directed second unit on Planet of Horror. And I got the bug that I thought, okay, directing may be what I can do. Because I had previously been a line producer for Roger. I had never directed, never thought that was in the cards for me, never thought that was, my strength. I thought, okay, I could do scripts, I could do schedule, I could do budget, I can hire crew, I can do all the mechanics of making a movie. But when I started directing second unit, I got interested in directing for the first time. So I went to Roger and said, I'm interested in directing. And Roger chuckled and said, basically, I want you to write a script. If I like it, you can direct it. The title is Alien Sex Shocker. And the story, really, and the story is aliens who kidnap human women for reproductive experiments. Well, I was in despair because on the one hand, Roger said I could direct this movie. On the other hand, it was Alien Sex Shocker. But I started work on the movie. Meanwhile, because I was seen to be as the next in line, the writers of Android came to me and said, we have this script. How'd you like to direct this? And, it was an early draft, but even then it was clearly, had more ambition and more heart than Alien Sex Shocker, although I did have a really good take on Alien Sex Shocker, which never got written, but I'm still saving it because it's interesting to me. So anyway, there's a lot of this back and forth. So I was working on them with the script with Don and Jim, and we were doing drafts of the script. And the producers were going to the Chicago guys, said, what do you say, guys? Roger's going to make this movie. And back to Roger, what do you say, Roger? These guys have the money, you're going to lose it. And finally, both sides agreed. It's kind of amazing, but they both thought, "Oh, well, I'm going to lose out if I don't step on board now." So we got the money, and Roger okayed the movie. So that's how it got made, and that's why it's not like the other movies that were being made at the time.
I see.
And we specifically went into it with the aesthetic that we didn't want it to really look like the movies that have been made at the time. There's been a lot of stuff written, which is actually not true, that Android was made out of sets from Planet of Horrors or Galaxy of Terror. No, it was all built from scratch. It was all built with the idea that it would have design that didn't look like, those movies. And we'd do as much as we could with the money, but it was a little bit of an outlier. And Roger, he'd agreed to put up $250,000 for his half of the movie, which would be domestic distribution. But of his $250,000, almost all of it was in kind, not in cash. In other words, the studio, the equipment, he had cameras, he had lights, he had grip equipment, he had the stage. So he had very little to lose, He had very, very little investment in the movie. So it was kind of like he took a flyer on it.
So how much were you involved with the development of the script?
They had, I couldn't tell you in detail. Donnie and Jim had the basic story of the movie. So whenever I got involved, it wasn't significant changes. It was really just fine tuning at that point. No, I think the main thing that happened between the time we got to go ahead and started shooting was the casting, because Don Opper, who was one of the writers, was also starred in the movie, and Roger did not want him to star in the movie. He thought it was a bad idea, just in principle, that the writer would also be the actor. He thought, there'd be rewrites on the set, it'll be costly, it'll take time, you'll lose money because it's but eventually we prevailed. We did have casting, we looked at other people, but he finally agreed to let Donnie star in the movie. And the other thing was, we got the script to Klaus Kinski, and he was interested in doing it, but he obviously cost more than we had budgeted for. So that was a little bit of a hiccup, because Klaus, who was pretty well known at the time from the Werner Herzog movies, was not someone who's seen by Roger as a value added. There's no value in domestic U.S. market to pay more for Klaus Kinski. So what we ended up doing was, because the other investors had foreign distribution, they saw value to having Klaus Kinski, because he's obviously a bigger name in Europe and South America than he is in the United States. So they put up the additional money to pay for Klaus.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when I tell people about the film, all I have to mention is the fact, I just say Klaus Kinski is building an android, and like, oh, really?
Yeah, I think now it's people of a certain age. I don't think 25-year-olds know much about Klaus Kinski.
Probably. Yeah. It's interesting to hear about Don Opper, because I think that he is so much the heart and soul of the movie. And I was going to ask you if he was always, seen as the lead actor in the film. He's such an unusual choice, but his innocence, I think, really carries so much of that story and that character that he's playing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I knew more then about acting, I probably would have had my doubts, because Don was. Don had done a lot of theater. He came from a kind of theater background, as did his brother Barry, who was the producer. But if I knew, and I had seen him, I'd seen him in just a lot of theater in Los Angeles. But I think if I had been a savvier director or producer, I would have thought, this is insane, trusting this movie to this, unknown kind of goofy looking guy. But when Roger said no, my immediate instinct was to say yes, but yes, of course he has to. And then the fact is that when we did audition people, it was clear that Don had a much more profound understanding of the character, and he and I were in sync about the portrayal of the character. So it became very easy to say, he's the one who should do this. I mean, if you think about getting to this conundrum, when I think about this kind of movie and creating androids, that if you're going to create a human being, why would you create someone with obvious flaws? Why would you create a perfect human being, which presumably Dr. Daniel is trying to do with his next generation. But I go back to, Jim Cameron was doing his movie at not long after this. And I remember when it was like, yes, you can make this with Schwarzenegger. Yeah, that'd be interesting. You're creating an android who speaks English with an Austrian accent. But anyway, leaving that aside,
I guess it makes him more human.
Our doctor created an android that looked just like Don Opper.
Yeah. Yeah. And his portrayal, I think, is so touching. I think that's the part that I can really relate to, his, sort of watching old movies and trying to sort of learn from them how to behave. I mean, that's, I first saw the film as a teenager. And I think that theme was something that I could really connect with, just, watching movies and thinking, okay, this is how the world works in a way.
Yeah. I think that's still true for a lot of people, especially if you're, it may not be movies, it may be other media now, but that's how you see, I love the story. I don't know if this is too arcane, but in the United States, there's a lot of baseball players who come from Latin America and Central America. And there's this kind of, I don't know if it's a myth or not, but it's certainly based in the fact that in the Dominican Republic, there are baseball players who would come to the United States and they learn English by watching reruns of the TV show Friends.
Okay.
And the show was hugely popular, and it was translated into Spanish. So first they'd watch in Spanish, then they started watching it in English, and that was the model for their vocabulary, their behavior was these 6 characters on Friends, and so one would tell the other, "Oh, you should watch Friends," and they'd have DVDs of the show. And I just think I love that idea of these 22-year-old Dominican baseball players watching Friends over and over again.
That's a good image, yeah. I think there's a lot of pop culture in the film, not just the movies that he watches. I mean, he watches Metropolis, he watches It's a Wonderful Life, I think. But he also has this, I don't know, is it a Bogart imitation with a hat that he's doing? So I was wondering if that sort of reflects your own relation to pop culture in a way.
Certainly in broad strokes. I think, when I try and think of what's influenced me, it's certainly the kind of movies that I grew up to value. It doesn't mean all movies, but you develop a taste, and that sort of informs how you see things should be done. But it's also, comes in combination with your own personality. I mean, for example, I just saw Bardo, the new Alejandro Iñárritu movie. And it's very long, and it's very dreamlike, very, kind of admittedly selfishly dreamlike, and it's huge, and it's very entertaining, and it's very imaginative. And I just think, well, I could never make this movie. I could never make a movie like this. It's just so different from the movies that I aspire to making. So there's that. I mean, that's not specifically It's a Wonderful Metropolis, but certainly, the idea behavior from what you see in those kind of things you treasure.
And there's also this, I think, very beautiful philosophical approach. I mean, obviously, anytime you have a movie about like an android, somebody who's sort of pretending to be human, you get into that question, what is it actually that makes us human? And I think the question how he's trying to figure out just to behave, or what love is, for example. Was that something that you sort of wanted to focus on, or wanted to explore more in depth as the filming went along?
I think if I knew more, I would. And so I can't say that it was really, we shot that movie in 20 days. It was sort of a blur. So what I would say is, yes, instinctively, that's what I was going for. When I think about what the story was, it's about gaining maturity. Really, it's about transitioning from youth to adulthood, and taking responsibility. And it's not, I wouldn't call Android a love story as much as a coming of age story.
Mhm.
So the emotion that he experiences is one that he's aspired to, but the transition that he makes is one that kind of catches him by surprise too,
Mhm.
which is going from not having responsibility to having to take responsibility. And we talked for 40 years about how much fun it would be to do the next chapter of that life, the sequel to Android, which is when he
Mhm.
comes to Earth, and what his reaction to being on Earth would be.
Mhm.
But that's another story that never got made.
Oh, that's too bad. I would love to see that. Don Opper coming back to do Android 2. I
Yeah.
mean, that would be amazing. So, what was it like working with so many people who are basically first timers in a sense? I mean, Don Opper, that was his first film that he made, and Bree Howard, that was her first movie and maybe her only movie. I'm not sure. And you were a first-time director. Was that
Mhm.
something that um, I don't know? Was that like an opportunity to sort of go about things in a different way or to experiment with stuff?
Only because we didn't know. I mean, like I said, what I had learned, and especially because I hadn't gone to film school, I hadn't learned how you're supposed to make movies. What I had learned was how you don't mess it up.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of what Roger stressed in his own, I would call it an aesthetic, because that's effectively what it is. What was important to Roger was shoot fast, get
Mm-hmm.
as much as you can, because for him, the movie was made in the editing room. This is Roger's aesthetic, which is you always get cutaways, you always get a lot of coverage, so that if you have problems, you can fix it later.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was very that was very ingrained in me. Like, how do we move fast? It wasn't we didn't spend a lot of time talking about motivation or talking about a character's history. All the stuff that to me now is like, okay, you've got to answer these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, the assumption was, my assumption was, okay, here's a script. The script is an outline for what we're going to do. You understand the script, I understand the script, so let's go shoot. and and it was only after you start seeing actors do things that aren't as you imagine, you go, oh, now why is that not working? And then again, for me, now one thing I have to say that was to Roger's great credit, he insisted that before I or anyone, I believe, who hasn't directed before you start directing, you have to take acting classes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had done that for some time with Nina Foch and Jeff Corey, both of whom were at that time very well known and established acting teachers, and so at least I had an understanding of the concept and how to communicate with actors. So that
Mm-hmm.
was a big help. Um, and I've seen a lot of directors, especially because I spent a lot of time working in television, and a lot of directors in television come from the crafts. So assistant directors will get to direct,
Mm-hmm.
cameramen will get to direct, sometimes editors will get to direct, and they often have a very limited and primitive vocabulary to talk to actors. That's a
Mm-hmm.
big problem, and they rely on the actors to basically direct themselves. So I credit Roger with forcing me to do that, to take acting classes, and so that when there was moments in performance which I thought were not serving the scene or not taking the direction that I had envisioned, I could communicate that, and
Mm-hmm.
that was a big advantage. Well, plus the fact that almost all the actors were basically completely inexperienced. I mean, Klaus and Norbert Weiser, who plays one of the convicts, are the only ones who had any real acting chops. So it gave me the opportunity to express myself in a way that maybe a more experienced actor have said, what do you know about it? um, and with Klaus, it was very interesting because well, I'll tell you the story. The first day he worked, we'd been shooting for probably 4 or 5 days with the with the other cast before he appears. And his first scene is the scene where he first shows up to the newly arrived convicts. And of course, they were very excited because they were going to be working with Klaus Kinski, and they had a lot of respect for him. And so we get on set, we meet. And I say, okay, let's rehearse action. And Klaus walks in. He says, and he literally says, so I walk in, I come here, blah, 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 blah. I walk out. And we were all like, okay, let's rehearse. So we do it again, action. Oh, I come in, I walk here, blah, 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 and I walk out. So that was the extended rehearsal. And I was kind of like stunned, and the actors were very disappointed and kind of stunned. And so we mark it and light it and start shooting. And all of a sudden it's a performance. It was kind of mind-blowing because he's very casual and very almost to the point of cavalier. But once the cameras are rolling, he's acting. Now, whether you think he was brilliant or terrible, it doesn't matter. From my point of view, he was playing this doctor in a way that I thought was, wow, that's what we wanted. So I was playing Dr. Daniel. So gradually, as I got more comfortable with him and confident in myself, I found myself, okay, and say, let's try it this way, or can you come in later, or any the normal kind of things you do to try and get the performance and the visual that you're going for. But that first day was like, stunning.
And since he has a reputation for being difficult, I guess that must have been quite daunting at that moment.
It was terrifying. I mean, I remember I was up nights worrying about what it's going to be like. Is it going to? But there was never anything like you can imagine of no, I'm not going to do that, or that's stupid, or why would I do that, or not showing up, or showing up late. Nothing. He came. He put on his costume, put on his makeup, and it was fun. Ultimately,
and it's an interesting performance, I think, because Kinski is usually known for these very big gestures, and I mean, he's so over the top in most of his roles. And in Android, he's really subdued and just very, I don't know, just a very quiet person, actually. I think much more nuanced than many of the other films that he's done.
Yeah, and that was again, it's kind of like, I guess you'd call it youthful arrogance. We don't want to do it like everybody else has done it. We want to do it our way. So we didn't, I guess it's still true. My feeling at the time was, and it still is, you have Klaus Kinski. You don't have to go super Klaus Kinski, because whatever he brings to it is going to make the audience have their own expectations of it. And he brings a lot of personality. I mean, he's even without doing much, he's got a lot of presence. So my thought always was, don't push for more of that. Put a lid on it, push for less of that, and let what there is kind of seep out. So I was happy.
So how much did you follow the reviews when the film came out?
The only ones that were really important were, I remember being very, very anxious about Variety, because that's the Hollywood trade paper, and that was the trade paper. And the critic for Variety was Todd McCarthy, who I had known from my grad school days. Todd was a friends of friends, and I had friends from Chicago who were critics, and Todd was a critic, and he was one of the 2 or 3 people whose reviews I had always respected. When I was working in Hollywood, I would always go to Variety reviews because I thought Todd really knew what he was talking about. So I remember after we'd screened it, I called him and I said, did you see the movie and are you going to review it? And he said, I am. And I said, he said, I can't, it's coming out tomorrow. Don't worry. And that was all he said. And his review, as I recall, it wasn't like, my God, this is, the best movie since Citizen Kane. But it was a very positive, and I thought very fair review. And after that, it was really, we tried to position the movie, and it was, I think in a way, we were about 2 years too early to really be successful,
Mm-hmm.
but we tried to position it as a kind of what would then be called an independent movie.
Mm-hmm.
There was no such thing really as an independent movie when this was made. It wasn't really till like, I think it was 2 years later, when Sex, Lies, and Videotape came out, that there was an idea of an American independent movie scene. And in '82, Alan Rudolph's first movie, which I can't remember the name of now, came out. It was kind of also in that strange, I think it was a studio made picture, but it had this very, low budget indie vibe. And there were other movies, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that Android was the first, but we were trying to position it as kind of an arty indie. And it was seen as, because it was a science fiction movie and kind of cheesy in its visual effects, and it came out of Roger's studio. It was a uphill battle. So when we could get into film festivals, which we got into a bunch of festivals, and we got into the theaters you'd hope to get into, like the Waverly and Greenwich Village, then it could play. And the people who saw it that way reviewed it positively. And then there were plenty of other reviews that just thought this is a, schlocky little, no budget movie without much going for it. And so, but really, in terms of awareness, the one I was really waiting, the one that had me on the edge of my seat, was that first review from Todd McCarthy.
Variety, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember Roger Ebert's review?
I do remember it because we played at the Chicago Film Festival. I remember he was, I couldn't quote it to you, but I remember it was sort of genially positive. He kind of like, sort of like a stray dog or a dirty street urchin. You kind of have affection for it, but it's not, it's not a champion, but you want to give it a pet, scratch behind the ears and say, good dog.
He really admired it, actually. I actually have the review here, and he lists sort of all the tropes from the Roger Corman movies, where he says, Android follows certain New World science fiction traditions. It is low budget. It contains one inexpensive but instantly recognizable horror star. It has scantily clad heroines. It is shot on good-looking sets that owe more to imagination than money. But in one key respect, Android steps outside the New World tradition. This is a thought-provoking film. And the interesting part of sorry, what?
No, I was going to say that's fantastic. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, he even goes on. He writes about films made by first films made by directors that were showing a lot of promise, and he mentions George Lucas's THX. He mentions Steven Spielberg's Sugarland Express. He mentions Dark Star by John Carpenter, and the Martin Scorsese film Who's That Knocking at My Door. And if you read that now, especially, you think, wow, that's, I mean, to put the film in that sort of company, that's I mean, sort of the biggest compliment that it could get, I think.
Yeah. No, that's good to hear.
So after you did Android, you made another film basically with the same crew, City Limits. Many of the people that you worked on with Android were returning to make City Limits. And I read that there were two different versions of the film, one screened with music by John Lurie, and then the film that was released that was sort of recut and then had a different score. And so I'm kind of thinking that there's a story behind this, that something happened to the film, so to speak.
Well, it's kind of a sad story because we all decided to stay together and keep working. We formed a company. The people who put money in Android put more money into our partnership to kind of finance us to keep going. The next project we made was City Limits, and we wanted to kind of expand our scope a little bit, get a little bigger picture, but keep kind of in a similar sort of, thematic range. I've got to say, I look back on City Limits with a lot of disappointment, and mostly in myself, because I think It was, quite frankly, I think it was more film than I can handle. I didn't really have the skill to tell the story in the way that it should have been told. We didn't have enough time. It was shot almost completely at night, so everything took a lot longer. And the one thing that I don't know about the one thing, but certainly one of the things that I think it fails at, and I haven't seen the movie in quite some time, but what I remember pretty clearly is, as an action movie, it's not very good. And that's I think my failing as a director, not knowing really enough about what I needed to do to make the action more exciting. And so we did screen it. We had and John did the score, and it was great. It really was. But it was a little bit of a scapegoat for some of the failings of the movie, because it was weird, and it was, if you know his music at all, you can imagine that it was somewhat atonal, definitely had a lot of personality, and for maybe a stronger movie, it would have worked, but this movie needed help. So we ended up, we did a couple of days of reshoots, did a recut, new score, much more mainstream score, and the movie still didn't work, in my opinion. So it's kind of a cloud over my past, and I think of it like, oh, that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's difficult to actually follow the storyline of City Limits, and those are the moments where I kind of feel like maybe something is missing there, because when you go from one scene to the next, just sort of at many points you're never quite sure how you get from A to B, and then you have a voiceover that sort of explains the backstory of how that happened, and you're like, oh, did I miss that? Was that in the movie? I think that's why I thought, okay, maybe that, essential scenes were sort of never finished or cut out of the movie or something like that.
I don't know about that. I don't think it's like scenes that were cut out of the movie. I just think it was my own inexperience as a storyteller to just not be clear enough on what the story was. I think, as a when I think back on the concept of it, the sort of three musketeers against this ruthless corporation. Okay, that makes sense. I can understand that, but it was not realized in a way that I think was successful. So
yeah, I think it has a lot of good aspects in it. I mean, the cast obviously is great. You have so many wonderful actors in that movie. And just in terms of the details, I mean, there's a lot to enjoy. Just, the scene where Don Opper is eating the cat food, and they're sort of trying to explain to him that he doesn't have to do that. Why? Because we're not cats. Those kind of details, I think, those are really enjoyable. And I think in terms of themes, it connects in some way with Android, the theme of
certainly,
young people rebelling against their upbringing, or they want to sort of leave home and venture out in the world to seek adventures and that kind of thing.
I it's mostly full of regrets for me that it didn't succeed, and that I pretty much that I didn't succeed in making that show work.
Yeah. So did you follow the reviews to that film at all?
Again, I think I did initially, but I knew from as soon as we started screening it that it was not working. Even after we redid it, it was just not going to be a good movie. So it was. I really wanted to just kind of move on at that point.
Yeah, and then I think you moved on to TV, and I think I think those were the two theatrical features that you made, right?
Yeah, I mean, City Limits was almost killed my career. So it's very difficult to look back on it because Android, as much as I'd love to believe that Ebert was right and I was going to follow the trajectory of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, City Limits put the brakes on that, and I couldn't get a job. And it was only, again, another stroke of luck and coincidence that Michael Mann, who was the creator and producer of the TV show Miami Vice, had been making his film The Keep in London when Android was released there. And Android had played at the London Film Festival and had come out of it, with a lot of positive press and played commercially in London, and he had seen it there. So when he started Miami Vice, I don't know if you know the show, it was a very, very popular TV show in the US, and starting about 85 or 86. And when the show first went on, it was much more conventional. And I think it was after 5 or 6 episodes that he decided he needed to mix it up. And he fired one of the lead actors, he replaced the cinematographer, and his other solution was no more TV directors. He thought that the TV directors at the time were very conventional and uninteresting, and he wanted to have people who didn't come from television. Which this is at Universal Studios, which is the most conservative at that time studio in Hollywood. So the idea of having directors who hadn't done television meant you're either going to have commercial directors who that meant, the reputation of a commercial director was a guy who spends a lot of money in a very short amount of time. Not what you offer television. Or first-time directors, which is almost unheard of at Universal Television. So he was trying to walk this fine line. There was no other, there weren't really, really hot film school graduates who could say, oh, they can do an episode of television. There was no channel for people to start their career in television. So someone like me, who actually had feature credits, had a credibility. And the fact that Michael had seen my movie in London in a kind of positive environment, it didn't mean I got they came looking for me, but it did mean there was a series of coincidences, one of which was, okay, first, City Limits had failed and I was unemployed. 2, I had a friend of a friend who was friends with Michael Mann's wife. So at some party, he's talking about his, TV show, and my name and Android gets mentioned. And so my agent, I had an agent, my agent gets a call inquiring about my availability to do a TV show, Miami Vice. Now, my agent was a feature agent and kind of looked down on television and mentioned this to me, but never had the kind of skill, drive, but never really pushed and said, okay, let's get booked. But meanwhile, I had heard they're asking about me in Miami Vice, which is, super hot show at that time. I mean, there couldn't have been anything better. So now remember the combination. I am broke, unemployed, no prospects, and basically living on the hope that this is actually a real thing. I'm telling my friends I'm going to direct Miami Vice. So I go to a party once this summer. This is 1983, I think, or 84. And the host says, oh, Aaron, you're going to be directing an episode of Miami Vice. You should meet my friend Dan. So I meet Dan, who is Dan Pine, who is I think at that time he was the co-producer or the story editor. He was the number 2 writer on the show. And we get to talking, we hit it off, and he goes to work on Monday and says, so I met this guy. He says he's directing an episode of Miami Vice to the producer, not to Michael, but to the line producer. And clearly my name had been on the list because he knew my name and said, well, what'd you think? And Dan said, oh, he seemed all right. And that literally led to them calling me up and saying, okay, do you want to do an episode?
Mm-hmm.
So, the coincidences of Michael Mann seeing Android in London, my friend of a friend who knew his wife and mentioned my name, my other friend who knew a writer on the show and introduced me to him, and and on and on. But anyway, that led to me getting a job on Miami Vice and having a career in television. It's just what Miami Vice was really popular, and if you it's every few years there's a show that everybody knows about. I mean, I guess I don't know what it would be now, maybe Stranger Things or The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, whatever it is. There's a show that like, oh, if you did that show, you've got to be good. Game of Thrones. It's kind of like a guarantee of credibility. So that once I not only directed an episode but got asked back to do another episode and another episode, I had credibility and certainly in action, police television, police shows and action shows in a way that City Limits couldn't destroy.
Yeah, I mean, Miami Vice has become such a cult classic, even over the years. I mean, a friend of mine has just bought the 5th version of the complete series in a new Blu-ray set. He already has 4 sets, and he's just bought a 5th version of it.
Well, tell me, can they use the music that they originally had? Because I remember the first set they put out, they had to replace a lot of the music because they had bought rights for broadcast, but not for DVDs. So, Miami Vice was always full of, very timely hit songs that then they couldn't use when they did the DVD releases.
Yeah, I think they restored them for the latest version. I mean, it's a European set, and they also talked about how they restored some of the dubbing and, for German television back at that point. The episodes were always cut a little bit short. They would always cut out a couple of scenes to, make it fit into a TV slot. So a lot of the shows from the 80s, you watch, Knight Rider or Miami Vice or what have you, all those 45-minute shows, there are always a couple of scenes missing, and that means they never got dubbed, and people in Germany never saw those episodes in full. And with this set, I think they restored all of it. And so I think they also restored the entire soundtrack and everything. So
wow,
really a painstaking effort that they did with the show. So it still lives on. I mean, it's really great, I think. So over all those years that you worked on television, did you ever have any plans to go back into a theatrical feature? Did you?
Plans is a not the word I would use. I mean, it was always the goal. It says more about my naivete than anything else. But I thought I'll go direct an episode of Miami Vice, and I'll do a great job, and that'll get me back into movies, and I'll be hireable as a movie director. And at that time, that was a pipe dream, because there was a very strict line between. It was almost like a caste system. There was commercial directors, there were comedy TV directors, there were drama TV directors, and there were feature directors. And to go from television to feature was almost impossible. Not completely. Obviously, people have done it, but it was really once you were a TV director, it was kind of like that was your thing. Now, one thing that some of my contemporaries did end up doing and were very successful for a while were going into TV movies. And it was some hybrid, because it's not really a movie and it's not a TV show, because it's a standalone. But even so, it's very difficult for even those people who are doing TV movies to get to do features, because it was seen as you're very much a journeyman controlled by the network and the studio, and don't have a vision, which is what was valued for a feature director. So to make a long story short, I tried and never could get anything off the ground.
I see.
And what I did do was start getting more into producing television, producing and directing. So the fellow I mentioned earlier, Dan Pine, who was the writer on Miami Vice, he and I became partners after that, and had a deal at Paramount for most of the 90s, developing television shows. So other writers' ideas, our ideas, we would develop them for Paramount. Paramount would take them out and pitch them. And my job was, at that time, it didn't exist, but it kind of became a job in the late 80s, early 90s as the television, what they call a producer director.
Mm-hmm.
So you're a producer from a directing background. So you're basically a creative producer. What they had in television up till that time was they might have directors who are on staff. For example, I directed several early episodes of the first season. It was a half season of Quantum Leap,
Mm-hmm.
which was a TV show. And because I had a background in production, and I knew, I felt very comfortable with budgets and schedules and hiring staff and that kind of thing. What I want to do is combine those skills and be a producer on a TV show that I want to be invested in, that I could direct sometimes, and basically prep the other directors and make sure that they kind of in the aesthetic of the show.
Mm-hmm.
I tried on Miami Vice to get that job, in fact, which they didn't really have that job, but I tried to create it with Dan's help. And it never happened. And then he and I became partners. And I kind of did that job on the shows that we did in as early as, 87, 88.
Mm-hmm.
And then it sort of evolved into a job. The studio saw there was a value to having a director who would be on staff and direct, out of a normal broadcast run at that time was 22 episodes. So you direct, 3 or 4 or 5.
Mm-hmm.
But you would be available. So if actors had an issue, if the directors, were getting into trouble with time or with location, if the writers, if something wasn't working and need to be rewritten, you have someone who's present who has that experience. So we formed a company, and basically that's what I did for the next 20 years is
Mm-hmm.
direct television and produce and direct.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it was, if you like a show, it's a great way to have a lot of creative control and satisfy your creative outlet, but have responsibility to a bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
And a show that has, ambitions, it's very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, especially in recent years, I mean, television has become so much more in terms of the storytelling, so much bigger and more ambitious. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, television, sometimes for worse, but mostly for better, it's become a medium where you can take stories that wouldn't fit in a movie, that are too big, too expansive, and draw them out and tell them over time. I mean, what's happened, the bad news is sometimes they go beyond what they're sort of the limits of the story they're trying to tell, and then it becomes embroidery. But when it works, you can get really, really deep into character and deep into consequence, and it's great.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, the perception of what television is and what it can be has, changed tremendously in the past 30 years.
Absolutely. And also that sort of class system that you talked about, that feature film directors didn't do TV or vice versa. And these days you see so much of it that people switch back and forth, and TV isn't seen as some sort of stepchild to what the theaters are showing. I think actually we're seeing sort of the different trend in a sense, right?
Yeah, it's gone to the extreme. I mean, it's very disturbing. I mean, I really like going to the movies, and to see that. I mean, especially now with all the the end of the year, you get a lot of movies that are up for awards, and it's hard to see a movie in a movie theater. I mean, literally, I'll give you an example. Banshees of Inisherin, Martin McDonagh movie. I want to go see it. There's not a theater in my neighborhood that's where the movie's playing. I can't find it. Now, what you can do is, a lot of the studios in LA, they'll have screenings for awards reasons. So you can find a screening that you can go to. But if I want to go, okay, see you, Christian, I'll talk to you later. It's now 2:00. Okay, I can go to a movie at 3:00. But what you're going to see is Top Gun Maverick or, animated Christmas movies, whatever, if you want to see Banshees of Inisherin, I got to go to who knows where. It's the whole thing, that seeing a movie in a movie theater seems to be becoming more and more in danger is very disturbing, because my feeling is, if you can push a pause button while you're watching a movie, something's wrong.
Yeah, and you're so easily distracted when you're watching it at home. I still go regularly to the theater, and there's a theater just in my neighborhood. And I know the person who runs the theater. I just talked to her, and she said it's terrible because people are just not coming to the movies anymore. They have, every once in a while they have this little sort of hit movie. I mean, she's doing what you would call an art house theater. So yes, she would show the Banshees movie and not the Marvel movies or stuff like that. So every once in a while there's a movie that really draws an audience. But mostly, I mean, oftentimes you go there and there are like 10 people in a 200-seat room. So
yeah,
she was kind of desperate, actually, when I talked to her.
It's really it's disturbing, especially because, I mean, for me, my favorite place to see movies was a movie theater that was like 5 minutes from my house, kind of like, but it was a multiplex, a 12 screen, but I don't know what you'd call it. It's kind of like a premium multiplex. They always had good sight lines. The theaters were big enough that you could, you weren't sitting in little, 5-row shoebox. The sound was always good. They were clean. The projectors were in good shape. The screens were in good shape. And they closed during the pandemic, and they have not yet reopened. And the company that owned them went bankrupt. So it's just like we're waiting and praying this place will reopen, because we want to go there to see movies. I'm very lucky because I'm a member of the Directors Guild. The Directors Guild has maybe the best theater in the world, but certainly a great movie theater, and I can go see movies there when they screen them. But that's 3 a week. If I can't go, I can't go. But it's really disturbing, because I think it diminishes. I mean, I've seen so many movies that I go to the movie theater and I think, man, it would not be the same to watch this at home. It wouldn't. I mean, it's the focus, the scope, the sound, the demand. The movie makes a demand of you, and you're there to accept it.
Yeah, you're sort of overwhelmed by it, and you share it with other people. I also like that kind of communal experience. When you go and see a comedy that's really funny, and you're in a room with 100 people, and everybody's really laughing, and I mean, that's the kind of feeling that you don't get at home. Never.
Yeah.
So I don't have any more questions about City Limits, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, Aaron, but just want to thank you for taking the time to talk about those two movies and, go back memory lane with me and really dive into those early years. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I can't say it's what I live for, because I'm always thinking about what the next movie is and what the next TV show is.
Yeah.
But it's it's always it's nice to think that what you did 30 years ago or 40 years ago still has a life, or still has someone who's interested in seeing it. And that's kind of what we do it for, is hopefully that the same way that I watch movies from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. You want it to have a life. So I appreciate you talking to me about it, and I appreciate your interest and your enthusiasm.